Today, we're going to break down one of the most foundational topics in applied behavior analysis, the functions of behavior. This is not just another vocabulary topic. It is the core logic behind functional behavior assessment, and it shows up constantly on both the RBT and BCBA exams. So instead of memorizing 4 labels, our goal today is to learn how to think functionally, how to analyze behavior the way the exam expects you to. Before we define anything, let's talk about why this matters. Functions of behavior drive treatment decisions. If you misidentify the function, your intervention will likely fail, even if it looks correct on the surface. On the exam, most scenario-based questions are really testing one thing: can you identify the maintaining consequence? So throughout this lecture, keep reminding yourself, analyze the consequence, not the appearance of the behavior. Now, let's define function clearly. Function refers to the environmental consequence that maintains a behavior over time. Behavior continues because it is reinforced, either through positive reinforcement, where something is delivered, or negative reinforcement, where something is removed. Importantly, function is determined through repeated ABC patterns. It is not based on intent, feelings, or assumptions. And that leads us directly into a very common mistake. Many students confuse what a behavior looks like with why it occurs. Topography refers to the form of the behavior: crying, hitting, leaving the seat. Function refers to the outcome that keeps it happening. The same tantrum might be escape in one setting and attention in another. Likewise, different behaviors may all serve escape. So always pause and ask yourself, what happened after the behavior? With that foundation in place, let's review the 4 primary behavioral functions: escape or avoidance, tangible access, attention, and automatic or sensory reinforcement. Each of these categories is defined by the consequence that follows the behavior. Now, let's go one by one. With that foundation in place, let's review the 4 primary behavioral functions: escape or avoidance, tangible access, attention, and automatic or sensory reinforcement. Each of these categories is defined by the consequence that follows the behavior. Now, let's go one by one. We'll start with escape. Escape behaviors are maintained by negative reinforcement. That means the behavior increases because it removes something aversive. Typically, that aversive stimulus is a demand, a worksheet, a chore, a social expectation. So the key diagnostic question is, what was removed? For example, a student cries and the worksheet is taken away. Or a child becomes aggressive and the instruction stops. Or a student leaves their seat and the teacher delays the task. In each case, something unpleasant is removed, and that removal strengthens the behavior. Always focus on removal, not delivery. Now here's where exam questions get tricky. Sometimes the teacher talks after the behavior, so students immediately choose attention. But if the worksheet was also removed, and that removal consistently follows the behavior, then escape is likely the true function. Similarly, don't confuse escape with automatic behavior. Ask yourself, would this behavior occur if no demand were present? That distinction is critical. Now let's shift to tangible maintained behavior. Tangible behavior is reinforced by access to a preferred item or activity. This is positive reinforcement. Something desirable is delivered. However, a motivating operation must be present. The item must actually be valuable at that moment. Without deprivation or desire, tangible reinforcement loses strength. For instance, a child cries and receives candy, or grabs an iPad and is allowed to keep it, or throws a tantrum and gains access to a toy. In each case, the reinforcer is the physical item. So ask yourself, what was delivered? Now here's a very common confusion. Sometimes an adult gives a toy and also talks to the child. So is it tangible or attention? The answer depends on which consequence most consistently maintains the behavior. If removal of the toy stops the behavior even when attention is present, the function is tangible. Always identify the primary reinforcer. Now that we've discussed tangible reinforcement, let's transition into attention-maintained behavior, and this is where many exam candidates make subtle but important errors. Attention-maintained behavior occurs when social interaction functions as the reinforcer. That interaction may be positive, such as praise, laughter, or eye contact, or it may be negative, such as reprimands or corrective feedback. What matters is not whether the interaction is pleasant. What matters is whether the interaction increases the future likelihood of the behavior. In other words, even scolding can strengthen behavior if it consistently follows the behavior and maintains it. The key diagnostic feature here is social mediation. If another person must respond for the reinforcement to occur, then attention may be the maintaining variable. As we move forward, keep that requirement of social mediation in mind. It becomes critical when we compare attention to automatic reinforcement. Let's make this more concrete. Imagine a student calls out during instruction. The teacher immediately turns, makes eye contact, and says, "Please raise your hand." Even though that statement is corrective, the student received direct social engagement. If calling out increases over time, that interaction may be functioning as reinforcement. Or consider a child who makes exaggerated noises and classmates laugh. The laughter becomes the reinforcer, even if the teacher attempts to ignore the behavior. Notice that attention can come from multiple sources: teachers, peers, siblings, or caregivers. And sometimes, peer attention is actually more powerful than adult attention. So when analyzing exam scenarios, don't just ask, "Did the teacher respond?" Ask instead, who consistently reacted, and did that reaction strengthen the behavior? This brings us to some common exam traps. One mistake is assuming that reprimands cannot function as reinforcement. They absolutely can, especially if the individual lacks access to social interaction otherwise. Another trap is ignoring peer attention. In classroom scenarios, students often focus only on the teacher's response. But if peers laugh every time a behavior occurs, that peer attention may be the true maintaining variable. Also, be cautious when tangible items are present. Sometimes an item is nearby, but it is not delivered as a consequence. The presence of an item does not automatically mean tangible reinforcement is occurring. So when you analyze attention scenarios, slow down. Identify the consequence that consistently follows the behavior across repeated examples. Consistency reveals function. Now let's transition to automatic reinforcement, and this is where conceptual clarity becomes essential. Automatic behaviors are maintained by internal sensory stimulation. The reinforcement is produced directly by the behavior itself. Unlike attention, tangible, or escape functions, automatic reinforcement does not require another person. It does not depend on social mediation. This is why automatic behaviors often occur when the individual is alone, during low-demand situations, or even in completely isolated settings. The behavior produces its own reinforcing consequence. When analyzing scenarios, ask yourself, if no one were present, would this behavior still occur? If the answer is yes, automatic reinforcement becomes highly likely. Let's expand with examples. Hand flapping may produce visual or proprioceptive stimulation. Rocking may produce vestibular input. Hair twirling may provide tactile stimulation. These behaviors often persist even when social consequences are absent. Importantly, automatic reinforcement is not limited to stereotypy. Certain forms of self-injury may also be maintained automatically if they produce internal sensory feedback. The key feature is that the consequence is inherent to the behavior itself. So rather than looking for something delivered or removed externally, you look for behavior that sustains itself without social interaction. Now let's clarify a very common confusion: automatic versus escape. At first glance, both may appear similar, especially if the behavior results in task disruption. However, escape behaviors are strengthened because a demand is removed. Automatic behaviors are strengthened because the behavior produces sensory input. Here's the diagnostic difference. If you remove all demands and the behavior continues, escape becomes unlikely. If you place the individual alone with no tasks and the behavior still occurs, automatic reinforcement is probable. In functional analysis, this distinction often appears between the alone condition and the demand condition. So always ask, is the reinforcement externally mediated or internally produced? Now that we've reviewed all four functions, let's integrate them into a decision-making process. When you encounter a scenario, do not jump to conclusions. Instead, walk through a sequence of analytical questions. First, what happened immediately after the behavior? Second, was something delivered, such as attention or a tangible item? Third, was something removed, such as a task or social demand? Fourth, did another person need to respond for reinforcement to occur? This structured questioning prevents impulsive guessing and strengthens your exam accuracy. This analytical process relies on ABC data. Antecedents tell us what sets the occasion for behavior. Behaviors tell us what the individual does. Consequences tell us what maintains the behavior. But remember, one isolated event does not determine function. We look for repeated patterns across multiple instances. The most consistent consequence across repeated occurrences is typically the maintaining variable. Patterns, not isolated examples, determine function. Once you identify consistent patterns, you formalize them in a hypothesis statement. A strong hypothesis links antecedent, behavior, and consequence in a testable format. For example, when presented with difficult academic work, the student engages in screaming in order to escape the task, maintained by removal of the worksheet. This statement is specific, observable, and directly testable. That is the level of clarity expected in BCBA level analysis. Now, let's talk exam strategy. Exam questions rarely say, "This behavior is maintained by escape." Instead, they describe a scenario. They may include emotional language, detailed backstories, or irrelevant contextual details. Your task is to filter out noise and identify the maintaining consequence. Ignore speculation about feelings or intentions. Focus only on observable contingencies. Sometimes multiple consequences occur. For example, a student tantrums, receives attention, and also gains access to a toy. Which is the function? The answer depends on consistency. If the toy is delivered every time and attention varies, tangible is likely primary. If attention is consistent and toy delivery is occasional, attention may be primary. Always choose the reinforcer that most reliably strengthens the behavior over time. Now, let's connect function to treatment. Escape-maintained behaviors require strategies such as demand fading or teaching tolerance. Tangible-maintained behaviors require functional communication training. Attention-maintained behaviors require differential attention procedures. Automatic behaviors may require sensory alternatives or competing stimulus assessments. The key principle is this: intervention must address the maintaining consequence. Treatment that ignores function is unlikely to succeed. Let's consolidate everything. Function determines intervention. Consequence maintains behavior. Topography does not equal function. And the most reliable way to identify function is through consistent ABC patterns. Think analytically, not emotionally. That is the behavioral mindset the exam expects. Before we close, remember this: the BCBA exam does not test whether you can memorize definitions. It tests whether you can analyze contingencies under pressure. If you can accurately identify the maintaining function of a behavior, you can select the correct intervention, you can eliminate distractor options, and you can think like a behavior analyst, not just a test taker. The only way to build that level of fluency is practice, not passive review, but active scenario analysis. If you're serious about mastering functional thinking and passing with confidence, you can practice full-length, scenario-based BCBA-style exams at www.bcbamockexam.com, because real confidence comes from thinking through contingencies again and again.